Welcome to the 30/30 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, my guest today is my friend Ari Whitten. Ari is the #1 best-selling author of the cutting-edge book Forever Fat Loss. He is a fat loss and nutrition expert who has been running a nutrition counseling and personal training business for over a decade. Ari has a Bachelor of Science from San Diego State University in Kinesiology with a specialization in fitness, nutrition, and health. He holds 2 advanced certifications from the National Academy of Sports Medicine and recently completed coursework for his PhD in clinical psychology, an education which rounds out all aspects of nutrition, fitness, and psychology for his optimal approach to health. If you enjoy my show, share it with your family and friends so you can help me spread our approach to health. And as always, remember to visit my website. That's 3030strong.com. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hello everyone, super excited to have one of my good friends in this health space, Ari Whitten. Ari, how are you doing, man?
I'm great. How are you, Guillermo?
I'm doing fantastic. You're killing it with the Energy Blueprint. I can't stop telling people about this program. I've been telling other friends in the health space and telling them, what you have been telling me for the past 2 years now, specialize, and figure out how, in a very concise way, affect a bunch of people. And you are doing it just fantastically with your program, super comprehensive.
Thank you.
But I'm not here to talk about the Energy Blueprint, man. I'm here to talk to you about a couple of months ago. You called me in a panic. It was like 2 a.m. No, it wasn't. It was like, dude, I've been working on this super secret project about adrenal fatigue. And I've discovered something that no one has brought up to light. And that's why I have you here. I want to clear up some confusion about adrenal fatigue.
Yeah, let's do it.
First of all, how did you decide to start studying adrenal insufficiency or adrenal fatigue? How did you decide to start following that lead?
I don't know exactly the origins of your story, but I would bet that probably my beginnings and your beginnings are not that different from one another. I started studying natural health and nutrition and physiology when I was in my early teens, like 14. And I had an older brother who was a personal trainer. I was really into lifting weights and wanting to get abs and biceps to get girls and that kind of thing. And that's where my interest in nutrition and physiology started, like a lot of teenage boys. And then I've really been pursuing it ever since. So over 20 years now, and pretty much obsessively, as my full-time passion. And I've got lots of formal education in the field. But honestly, my formal education is probably 1%, maybe 2% of the knowledge that I've accumulated over all the years. For most of that time, I've been in the holistic, sort of integrative, functional sort of space. And I'm going to cut out a lot of details of the story here because I know we're a little short on time. But a few years ago, I switched my focus really to the science of energy and fatigue. And one of the things that came to my attention was this whole concept of adrenal fatigue. And I actually, you have to understand, I had been studying, again, in all these holistic circles for many, many years. So I actually was under the impression that adrenal fatigue was like well established. Everybody already knows this is true. I mean, there are dozens of books written about it, thousands of articles written about it. I was thinking there's probably a mountain of science, already developed around this condition. And so it was odd to me at the time that conventional medicine was really brushing the whole thing off and kind of saying like, hey, adrenal fatigue. Oh yeah, you quacks can talk about adrenal fatigue. That's all a bunch of nonsense. And I was somebody who believed in adrenal fatigue, was teaching my clients about adrenal fatigue every day and, adrenal supplements and things like that. So I was actually really annoyed that all these conventional medical doctors brushing the whole thing off as nonsense. And it became my kind of idea to write a book. I really wanted to say, like, kind of stick it to all these conventional MDs and be like, hey, I understand science, as much as you guys understand science. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write like an evidence-based book about adrenal fatigue. Like, here's what all the science says. Here's all the science that shows that adrenal fatigue is a real condition, yada, yada, yada. So you guys can't brush this whole thing off as a bunch of pseudoscience. So I started exploring the science, and what I quickly discovered is that there's almost nothing there. And I mean, I don't mean this in any sort of hyperbolic, exaggerated way. Like, please, if anybody doubts me, go on to PubMed right now and do a search for adrenal fatigue, just quotes around adrenal fatigue. So it comes up with that exact phrase. And you can see for yourself how much research actually exists on this. It's almost nothing. So this concept, this condition's been around for almost 20 years, or actually it's now exactly 20 years. It was coined in 1998 by James Wilson. And in the span of 20 years and thousands of articles and dozens of books being written on it, somehow there's virtually no actual scientific evidence on this topic. So that struck me as odd, and I kind of just let it sit for a while. Like, I didn't really know what to do with that. I still was kind of thinking adrenal fatigue's real, maybe it just hasn't been studied yet. But then I kind of had a little breakthrough when I discovered this survey that was done. It was originally a survey from the CDC where they looked at just like a symptom survey, just a regular symptom survey with people with chronic fatigue syndrome. And they said, basically, do you have this symptom? Do you have tender lymph nodes? Do you have post-exertional malaise, post-exertional fatigue after you work out, you're wiped out for a couple of days? Do you have trouble standing up? Do you have trouble sleeping? Do you have brain fog? Do you have joint pain? Things like that. And so they gathered all these statistics. So picture a graph of, this symptom, brain fog, trouble standing up, joint pain, trouble sleeping, yada, yada, yada. And then a graph for each one. So, 73% said yes to this one, 61% said yes to this one, 59% said yes to this one, and so on. And there was a site, I found it, I think it was called Adrenal Advice or something like that. And it was an article where the guy was actually, ironically enough, trying to make the case for adrenal fatigue. And basically, he just conducted sort of an informal survey, the same survey as this CDC one, with his audience of people who were either self-diagnosed with adrenal fatigue or suspected they had adrenal fatigue, or were actually diagnosed by a practitioner who believes in adrenal fatigue. And then he gathered this data. And what was remarkable about it was the numbers, the percentages of people saying, yes, I have this symptom, yes, I have this symptom, were almost identical to the people with chronic fatigue syndrome. I mean, literally every single one of these dozens of symptoms, I've graphed the percentages. If you go to my site, theenergyblueprint.com, is adrenal fatigue real, you'll see the actual chart of all these symptoms. And you can see the percentages are almost identical. And so you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, chronic fatigue syndrome are saying all these people with chronic fatigue syndrome are saying, yes, I have this symptom, this symptom, this symptom. The people who suspect they have adrenal fatigue say exactly the same things to all of these over a dozen different symptoms. Are these really two completely distinct conditions, right? So I started to have that thought, and then I realized actually there is a body of evidence on chronic fatigue syndrome and cortisol levels and adrenal function and HPA axis function. And in fact, it's been studied for over 20 years. And then I looked at three other sort of recognized chronic fatigue syndromes: burnout syndrome, another one called exhaustion disorder or stress-related exhaustion disorder, and fibromyalgia. And so these are all recognized by conventional medicine as legitimate conditions. And it turns out, unlike adrenal fatigue, there's a mountain of scientific evidence for over 20 years of scientists actually studying cortisol levels and HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis function in these conditions, because it's been suspected for over 20 years it's been theorized by many practitioners that these conditions may have something to do with HPA axis dysfunction or cortisol levels. These ideas have been floated around there for literally over a couple decades. So we have these recognized medical conditions, fatigue conditions, and they match up really well with the kind of the idea of adrenal fatigue in terms of symptomology and the description of how it happens and so on. And unlike adrenal fatigue, we have this big body of scientific evidence that we can analyze to see if this is in fact a real thing. If cortisol abnormalities or HPA axis abnormalities are causing these fatigue conditions. So that's kind of how the whole thing evolved. It evolved originally from me wanting to write a book proving that adrenal fatigue is a real thing, to me realizing there's no science on this, so I got to look deeper. And then looking at all this other body of evidence on these other fatigue conditions, that's kind of how it evolved as far as why I became interested in this.
Ari, you're just a flip flopper, man. and
Yeah.
that's the problem, if as scientists we have to follow evidence, and sometimes the evidence doesn't support us. And when we find the evidence that does support our, for the benefit of our clients or our patients, changing with the evidence, it's the mark of a good scientist. Not sticking to your guns and saying no, trying to nitpick the articles to see if they were funded by big pharma, or did big sugar give you some money, or trying to look in the nuance to see if that's the reason why it doesn't agree with your own perceived biases. What impressed me the most is that you actually went and looked at every single adrenal fatigue study. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, and like you just alluded to, there's so many people that unfortunately cherry pick the literature to support their preconceived notions. It's a huge pet peeve of mine. I cannot stand when people do that. I think it leads to just so much confusion and misinformation that's out there where, I mean, from dealing with people how confused people are. People don't know what to believe anymore because there's so much misinformation out there that is seemingly scientific, because people will cherry pick a few studies to support their perspectives. But what you can't see is that they're leaving out 10 other studies that conflict with what they're saying. So my vision here was, I want to look at every single study that has ever been done on this topic, that is even remotely relevant to this. And I'm going to put all of them out there. I'm not going to selectively pluck. I'm going to say, here's the entire list of all of this, study by study, listed out by date, from 1995 till the present. And that's exactly what I've done. And so, anybody can go and fact check me if they want. And they can say, if they find some study and they can say, hey, you left this one out, yada, yada. Well, I dare you, please test me on it. Because trust me, I literally spent months combing through the literature with, I mean, unbelievable amount of time that it took to do this, to find every study that's there. And basically, this is how it breaks down. There's 59 individual studies, randomized controlled studies mainly, but some other types of studies in there as well. Mainly randomized controlled studies, and then 20 literature reviews, systematic literature reviews, and often meta-analyses too, which are, for people that are unfamiliar with that, just like a review of all the other evidence. So basically, what I'm doing is essentially a systematic literature review, but there have been many other researchers and groups of researchers that have previously done reviews on other selections of the evidence that existed at the time that they were doing it. So, and usually it's on a more narrow topic. So they might have just done it on burnout syndrome, for example, or just done it on fibromyalgia, or just done it on chronic fatigue syndrome, for example. So yeah, 59 studies and 20 literature reviews. And basically these are the results. So I'm just going to break it down by numbers. So of those 59 individual studies that are looking at cortisol levels and chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, burnout syndrome, exhaustion disorder, here's how it breaks down. 15 of those 59 studies give evidence for lower morning cortisol levels in people with either chronic fatigue syndrome or burnout, etc., relative to normal healthy people.
Okay, so let's time out right there. So the cortisol pattern, a normal cortisol pattern, would be high in the morning and then decreasing throughout the day, and at night it would be lower. And this makes sense because in the morning you want to have high blood pressure, you want to have a little bit of a faster heart rate. You want to be sharp, so you want your cortisol level to be high. Now, if you think about having high cortisol at night, then you can't fall asleep. So the idea is that, okay, so in someone that is adrenal deficient or has adrenal fatigue, you would have low cortisol level in the morning, so then you can't get up and do the activities that you would expect.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'll just add a quick digression that if you actually look at the research, it's interesting how much discussion, even as of 2018, how much discussion among researchers there are as far as like, around the morning cortisol response. They're kind of like, well, we really don't understand why this happens, but there's a morning cortisol response, and maybe it's for like helping to mobilize energy and kind of respond to the stressors of the day. But actually, even after studying this for several decades, researchers still can't tell you precisely why there is a morning cortisol response. But anyway, so yes, there is a morning cortisol response. After we wake up, we have this kind of increase in cortisol levels, and and then it dips down, and as you said, goes down the rest of the day and is low and low and low through the night, and then rises the next morning. And then like you integrated here, the whole concept of adrenal fatigue is essentially that chronic stress wears out your adrenals. Your adrenals can't produce enough cortisol, and then you get low cortisol levels. Now, they don't even actually, in most cases, make the distinction that it's specifically morning cortisol that will be low. I mean, a lot of people just say their adrenals can't produce enough cortisol. But let's just say that it's only they can't produce enough cortisol only at the specific time of day of morning time, and just look at that literature because and the reason I say that is actually to be generous, because if you look at the literature on like afternoon and evening and nighttime cortisol measurements, I mean, almost universally there's no detectable difference. Even in people who are very severely ill, you're not going to find differences there. So any differences that do emerge are much more likely to emerge in specifically the morning awakening response in cortisol. So, basically, if the adrenal fatigue theory is real, we expect to find certain predictions, right, about whether this is actually a real thing or not. So, as one example, like basically what we should find, if adrenal fatigue is a real thing, we should find that all, or at least a large majority of people with chronic fatigue or burnout have low cortisol levels, right? I mean, very obvious prediction. We should also find, prediction number 2 is basically we should find low cortisol or some type of cortisol abnormality at the onset or early stages of the fatigue condition. Like as somebody's starting to have symptoms and fatigue, if the cortisol levels are causing those symptoms, we should expect to find cortisol abnormalities at that stage. The third prediction is we should see a reliable relationship where cortisol levels and abnormalities relate to a person's symptoms. In other words, the more severe a person's chronic fatigue, the more severe their adrenal abnormality should be, or HPA abnormality. We should also see, another prediction is that as symptoms improve, so should cortisol levels. Like as a person improves and gets better, we should see that their cortisol levels normalize. And the last one is if these people have low cortisol and that's causing their symptoms, then we should see that by correcting the cortisol levels, like for example, administering hydrocortisone, which is very commonly done by a lot of people who believe in adrenal fatigue, we should see that that alleviates their symptoms. So in fact, all of these things have been tested, and there's a large body of evidence on these subjects. So again, 15 of 59 studies gave evidence for lower morning cortisol levels in people with chronic fatigue or burnout. 11 of 59 gave evidence for higher morning cortisol levels. So again, just pointing out the contradiction there. And 33 of 59 studies showed no significant differences whatsoever between people with chronic fatigue syndrome or clinical burnout or fibromyalgia or exhaustion disorder, you name it, no differences whatsoever between people with those chronic fatigue conditions, oftentimes with debilitating chronic fatigue, no differences in cortisol between them and normal, healthy people without any health problems.
And that is fascinating. And you showed me a document, and with all of this, and I was like, whoa, has no one done this? And
Yeah, and no one has.
what's insane is that I was kind of like depressed because oh man, I've been duped. But in reality, my job as a doctor is being able to diagnose something using testing and being able to come up with that diagnosis. And I think what happened is, the signal and the noise. And the noise is that a lot of people are having trainings on how to reverse adrenal fatigue and what's their adrenal fatigue protocol and how to test for adrenal fatigue. And it's like, if you have IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, it's like this overreaching, non-specific diagnosis. And how you fix IBS might be in so many different ways. Like, for example, you might have SIBO, you might have a parasite, you might have viral gastroenteritis. But if you fix the underlying cause, you also fix the overreaching nondescript syndrome. So, not saying that that adrenal fatigue is an ICD-10 code or anything like that, but maybe we were misdiagnosing the patient, and by doing certain interactions with the patient and providing certain protocols, we were also addressing the root cause. And that's where the brilliance of your whole discovery is.
Let's dig in a little bit more to the science around adrenal fatigue. So, like intervention studies, for example, among those 59 studies, there were 10 intervention studies. And so among those 10 intervention studies, what that means is they took people with burnout syndrome or chronic fatigue. They did some kind of intervention to get them better. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or some kind of stress relief therapy, or graded exercise therapy. Whatever the case may be, there were various interventions. So of those 10 intervention studies where they tracked people, and some of these were really impressive studies, they tracked people out to 6 months or 8 months and so on. So of those, 3 of the 10 showed a connection between improvements in symptoms and cortisol levels changing. 7 of 10 studies showed a complete disconnection between improvement in symptoms and cortisol levels. So in other words, a lot of these people got better, and in some cases completely better, and there were no changes in cortisol levels that accompanied that. So to put it in a different way, these two phenomenon are disconnected. Whatever cortisol abnormalities may be present in a minority of people do not seem to be the main thing causing these symptoms of the condition itself. And there's a number of systematic literature reviews that have concluded essentially that there's contradictory findings. They all say this. There's contradictory findings. Some say low, some say high. Lots of them show there's no difference between people with these fatigue syndromes and normal healthy people. And there's some studies that have specifically suggested that these cortisol abnormalities are not causing the condition, but are likely an epiphenomenon of the condition. In other words, in a subset of people, whatever that proportion is, like I said, about 33 of the 59 studies showed normal levels of cortisol, and then you have a proportion of people that either will show up with high or low cortisol levels. So what they're saying is that it's an epiphenomenon, which means a subset of people with those conditions, chronic fatigue syndrome or burnout, will have other things going on in their life, or maybe things that emerge from the condition itself, like, for example, poor sleep is extraordinarily common in people with chronic fatigue syndrome and burnout syndrome. So poor sleep in and of itself has been shown to cause low morning cortisol levels. Okay, so in other words, the direction of causation is that poor sleep disrupts morning cortisol levels, and therefore a portion of the people, whatever portion, like let's say have sleep disorders, which a huge chunk of people with chronic fatigue syndrome have overt sleep disorders, obstructive sleep apnea or sleep movement disorders, and they sleep poorly. Okay, so that chunk of people who sleeps poorly, they're going to test for low morning cortisol levels, and they're going to skew that overall data towards, saying, oh, people with chronic fatigue syndrome have lower cortisol levels. There are also certain medications, antidepressants, that will lower morning cortisol levels. Being overweight will lower morning cortisol levels. Night eating late at night will screw up morning cortisol levels. Simply being more of a night owl chronotype, and we know that, by the way, being a night owl chronotype is a predictive factor for getting burnout or chronic fatigue syndrome. So simply being more of a night person rather than a morning person, you'll test with lower morning cortisol levels, regardless of whether you have chronic fatigue syndrome or not. So if you and I, two healthy guys, get our cortisol levels tested, and I'm a night owl and you're a morning person, we can both be equally healthy and energetic, but I'm going to show up with low morning cortisol levels purely because my circadian clock is set to more of a night owl rhythm, right? So all of those things will cause low cortisol levels in people who don't have any kind of adrenal fatigue. This is a hormonal response that occurs in people in these situations. It's not that the adrenals have been worn out and can't produce enough cortisol. It's just that they've shifted their rhythm a little bit, and they've been altered in some way, or the HPA axis has been altered in some way by these epiphenomenon sort of symptoms causing the HPA axis abnormalities. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense, and other things that I can think about, is like, for example, if you have a nutritionally deficient diet where you're not taking enough B6 or B12, then you're not taking the nutrients needed for your output of cortisol to be normal. So it's not, let's just give you hydrocortisone, it's let's look for the underlying cause, because B6 and B12 are not only necessary for your adrenal function, they're necessary for a bunch of things. For example, methylation, cognitive response, and so many different things. But we're just focusing on one aspect of the need, and instead of replenishing what's missing, we're going one step above and trying to figure out a case, by correcting a symptom. And that's what I see, that's what I see at the practice. It's people that think or believe that they have or have self-diagnosed with adrenal fatigue, and they have been treated with something to, like rhodiola, to keep cortisol levels higher.
Do you mean licorice
Yeah,
rather than
sorry. Yeah,
rhodiola?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Licorice. Yeah. So the mechanism of action of licorice is it maintains your level of cortisol a little bit higher, but that doesn't mean that having blood cortisol levels automatically gives you the needed energy to prevent fibro, burnout syndrome, or chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, in your studies and you're looking at the literature, have you found one common thread between all of these things?
Great question. So I wouldn't say that it's well established for all of these conditions. Like burnout syndrome hasn't been yet, exhaustion disorder hasn't been tested yet. But within chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, within the last 5 to 10 years, there's really an emerging a new paradigm, and lots and lots of research has come out really pointing to the mitochondria as being central to chronic fatigue. And there have been many studies that have looked at this in different ways. Some studies have tried to assess for mitochondrial dysfunction, which they found, and they found different kinds of mitochondrial dysfunction. But most intriguingly, what they found is that overall the mitochondria seem to be sort of shut down more than anything else. Not necessarily that they're terribly damaged and dysfunctional due to damage, though some studies have actually found that. But according to Robert Naviaux, who is one of the leading chronic fatigue researchers in the world, what's actually happening is not so much that the mitochondria are necessarily damaged, but that they're being regulated in a way where they are intentionally being shut down. And so one of the things we see in people with chronic fatigue syndrome is low overall mitochondrial energy production and high glycolysis energy production. So this is energy production that occurs really inefficiently outside of the mitochondria and produces lots of lactic acid in the process. And so we also know that people with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia have lots of lactic acid. And we also know that one of the classic symptoms, in fact, a diagnostic symptom, is called post-exertional malaise, which is basically like after some bout of physical activity that they'll feel exhausted and wiped out for like a day or two or three following that activity. And so what's going on there is they have this massive production of lactic acid being poured into the blood, and now the body has to deal with that. But what really seems to be going on here as a fundamental thing, especially talking about severe chronic fatigue. So we can talk about more moderate fatigue, can be a result of a lot of things, might be a result of like SIBO, might be a result of very commonly circadian rhythm and sleep disruption. Just poor nutrition and nutritional deficiencies can be a cause. Toxin exposures of various kinds can potentially be a cause. There are lots of potential things going on there. But with severe fatigue, severe chronic fatigue, it really is about mitochondrial shutdown. And Robert Naviaux has shown in his work through something called the cell danger response, which is basically the notion that mitochondria, which we're all commonly taught are cellular energy generators, are powerhouses. These are the places in the cell that sort of take in carbs and fats primarily and pump out ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, cellular energy that all of our cells run on. And that's true. Our mitochondria are that is a key role for them. But what this new paradigm is showing is that our mitochondria are actually much, much more than just these sort of mindless energy generators that take in carbs and fat and pump out energy. And in fact, they are essentially like the canaries in the coal mine. They're environmental sensors, and their job is to detect what's going on in the environment and to determine if there's any kind of threat present or if things are safe. And if there are threats present, if it's getting lots of threat or danger signals, those mitochondria then initiate a cascade of signaling processes. And this has been outlined in Robert Naviaux's work as far as all the details of the signaling cascade, whereby and the rest of their body mobilize resources towards defending the body and defending the cells. So in other words, mitochondria are danger detectors, and their job is to determine whether to direct resources and energy into producing energy or to cellular defense. Okay, now as an example of why this would be an important function, as you know, Guillermo, certain bacteria and viruses can actually hijack the mitochondria or the energy produced by the mitochondria to fuel their own replication. So if the mitochondria were not able to detect that sort of energy steal going on, it would allow those bacteria and viruses to replicate rampantly and just go crazy and spread, and the cell would have no way of like really detecting what is going on there. And so in that paradigm, it's kind of like, you know, these viruses or bacteria kind of spread, and then the immune system kind of detects them and goes to war with them. But there's actually a whole other layer to the story, which is actually that the mitochondria are sensing that there's energy steal going on, and then initiating at the cellular level this cascade of events that essentially shuts down the mitochondria, shuts down energy production, which results in the symptom of fatigue. So to make this very practical for everyone listening, think of the last time you got a flu or a cold. What was one of the key symptoms?
Yeah,
fatigue,
malaise,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So now you understand why, right? It's because your mitochondria are literally shutting down and not producing as much energy. So shut down the mitochondria, and then the cell wall of the cell actually becomes more rigid and tries to kind of seal off the cell to not allow things to flow in and out of the cell quite so easily. And then the cell will increase oxidation. So instead of oxygen flowing through the mitochondrial electron transport chain to produce energy, a lot of that oxygen now gets redirected to form superoxide in order to help fight off and kill the pathogen that's in the cell. So that's kind of the cell danger response. Now, if enough damage occurs, in that cell, the cell will essentially self-destruct, apoptosis. Okay, it's programmed cell death. And in that process, one of the things that happens is the cell kind of self-destructs, and then some of the energy molecules like ATP and ADP and AMP and so on will actually leak out of the cells and get into the bloodstream. Okay, and you will actually have ATP floating around in your bloodstream. And ATP should not be in your bloodstream. ATP is meant to be inside of your cells, produced by mitochondria to power functions of the cell. So then you get ATP floating around your bloodstream, and this is something called purinergic signaling. And basically, it turns out that our cells throughout the body have purine receptors, and so they can sense these molecules like ATP and ADP floating around the bloodstream where they shouldn't be. And then once they detect those, they go, oh, that's a danger signal. That must mean there's cells that are dying off in the rest of the body because they're fighting some kind of danger, whether it be a pathogen or heavy metals or some other kind of toxin or any number of other different potential stressors. But that cascade, I'm simplifying things as far as the overall, all the details of it, but that essentially now can alert all the cells and organ systems of your body. It's time to go into cell danger response mode and shift out of energy production mode. Does that make sense?
100%. And what I see, again, going back to symptoms versus actually underlying cause, is that you can test how much lactate you have, okay? And you can drink sodium bicarbonate and buffer the lactic acid. But that will not fix or that will not activate the mitochondria. That's another symptom. So just like with the flu, you get the malaise. Taking tons of caffeine is not going to destroy the pathogen that is making you sick. And that's what's interesting, because we do see people getting better after doing adrenal protocols. But what these adrenal protocols are doing is they're changing habits. They're giving you a better diet. You're changing your circadian rhythm. You're detoxifying. You're doing all of these things that eventually, by proxy, help you activate your mitochondria.
Yeah, and that's great that you brought that up, because, as you said, a lot of the different strategies that are commonly used to treat adrenal fatigue also affect the mitochondria. So just as one example, like let's take working on someone's sleep, for example. Does sleep only affect somebody's adrenals? No, it affects dozens of physiological systems. It affects everything, essentially. So, and especially the mitochondria. And just to look at that in more details, there are actually several mechanisms by which good sleep affects mitochondria. One simple one is, let's say somebody has bad circadian rhythm habits and they have lots of blue light exposure at night and they sleep in a room that's not totally dark. And so they're chronically suppressing melatonin. Okay, well, we all know melatonin's involved in triggering sleep onset and helps us sleep. But what most people don't know is melatonin actually gets into mitochondrial membranes and is involved in stabilizing and protecting and even regenerating mitochondrial membranes. So what happens if you chronically have poor circadian rhythm and sleep habits? Well, you're chronically not getting as much melatonin every single night as you should be, and that's translating into mitochondria not being protected and repaired as well as they should be. And then what happens when you have that? Well, now they're much more sensitive and fragile in the face of all kinds of different stressors, whether toxins or infections or psychological stress and so on. There's also, it was recently discovered last year that there's a glymphatic system of the brain, and that actually every night when we sleep, when we get into deep sleep, the spaces in between our neurons actually expand to allow drainage of the fluid in our brains. I mean, this was a breakthrough discovery that just happened last year. And so we drain toxins from the brain every single night when we sleep deeply. Well, what happens if you don't get enough sleep, or if you don't sleep well and you don't sleep deeply? You don't have good sleep efficiency where you're spending lots of time in the deep sleep phases. Well, guess what? Now you're not spending enough time. Let's say your body needs 5 hours of time in those phases of deep sleep every night, just throwing out a random number. And in order to fully empty out all the toxins from the brain and drain everything, get it out of there. But you, because of poor sleep or some sleep disorder or just not giving yourself enough sleep or poor circadian rhythm habits, now you're only giving it 3.5 hours every night. Well, guess what? That adds up and you start to accumulate toxins in the brain. And this is not only linked to fatigue and brain fog and things like that, but also overt neurological disorders. So there's lots of, and there's more actually mechanisms by which toxins and things like that and sleep can affect mitochondrial function. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things going on there.
And that's the beauty of going to an integrative practitioner that is not looking for like A to B response, meaning, oh, you have suppressed cortisol, let's give you cortisol, let's wait. You have, it's more about like what is the overreaching approach that we can do right now to affect as many physiological responses, and it goes back to food, exercise, and diet.
Yeah, and actually, let me add something, because thank you for bringing something up there, because one of the things I didn't go into before is there have actually been 3 studies that have tested hydrocortisone interventions in people with chronic fatigue syndrome. And in many cases, those people actually do have low morning cortisol levels. So you'd think, well, if the low morning cortisol levels are contributing in any way to these symptoms, raising the cortisol levels should fix or at least help the symptoms, right? And in fact, the first of those studies showed possibly a minimal effect, and then the second one showed kind of possibly a minimal effect, and then the third one was a long-term 6 months randomized controlled study crossover trial, basically as good as science gets, like the most well-controlled study that you can possibly conduct. So I have one group on the hydrocortisone for 3 months, another group on placebo, and then switch them for the next 3 months. So now the group that was on placebo gets the hydrocortisone, and the group that was on hydrocortisone gets the placebo. And double blind, so neither the people nor the researchers knew who was getting what. Guess what they found? No detectable differences in symptoms between people getting hydrocortisone versus placebo. In other words, this is a way to test the idea as to whether it truly is the adrenals and the cortisol levels that are causing this problem. And so we were just talking about, these adrenal fatigue interventions that people will do, like improving sleep or herbs and things like that. Well, that kind of tests the idea as to whether it truly is the adrenals that are causing the problem. Is it the cortisol levels or is it something else? Well, like I said, sleep affects mitochondria, stress affects mitochondria, adaptogenic herbs. Guess what? Adaptogenic herbs have a huge impact on mitochondrial function, sometimes directly stimulating mitochondrial recapacity, decreasing inflammation, decreasing free radical production in the mitochondria, essentially giving safety signals to the mitochondria to get them out of cell danger mode. So I think if you look at the overall body of evidence, the idea that the main mechanism is the adrenals or cortisol, it does not hold water. And that even in the case of people who believe in adrenal fatigue, who are doing interventions thinking that they're trying to fix the adrenal fatigue or HPA axis, I think what's actually going on is those interventions are actually affecting other physiological systems primarily.
Upon the realization of that, is like I haven't been wasting my time. I'm actually, addressing the underlying cause. I just had the wrong name. And that was super amazing to have that realization, and so being able to address it like that is just fantastic. So tell us a little bit, we have a little bit, like 10 minutes. Tell us about the Energy Blueprint. What is it, and how can people get a hold of it, and how can you help them resolve, your burnout syndrome, your CSF, your fibro?
One of the things that I've found, and this is pretty well established at this point in the people who are studying chronic fatigue seriously, is that there isn't just one trigger. There isn't one cause. Some people have psychological stress and emotional trauma is a big contributor for them. Other people, poor nutrition is a big contributor. Other people, infections, is a big contributor. Other people, Toxins, certain toxin exposures can be a big contributor. I talked to a woman, there's a woman who reached out to me just the other day who lives in the UK, and there was when she was a little kid, she suffered an environmental accident where there was this huge incidence of aluminum from some industry in the neighborhood dumping all this aluminum in the groundwater. Aluminum poisoning became rampant in this little town that she lived in growing up because of this accident that occurred. And so she was poisoned, and she's been dealing with chronic fatigue syndrome for like 30 years ever since then. And she emailed me and she's like, "Is there any hope for me? I've tried to see so many people, no one can help me. I listened to some of your stuff and I'm feeling a little bit hopeful, but I'm just so skeptical of anything and so pessimistic that anything can help me." So you have stuff like that. I mean, environmental toxins are real, and they are a serious problem, and they can be the main cause for some people. Sleep and circadian rhythm, another huge cause. It is, at least in my experience, it is at least a contributor in almost every case. Gut issues, another cause. Another one that is a huge aspect here that very few people are even aware of is one of my favorite, and I know your favorite subjects too, which is hormesis.
Exactly.
Yeah, and hormesis, which is basically, to simplify it, it's basically a temporary stressor, metabolic stressor, that stimulates the body to make adaptations that make it stronger and more resilient. The most common example that most people will be familiar with is, of course, exercise. Physical exercise works as a temporary stressor that stimulates the body to become stronger. But there are many others. So temperature stress, heat, cold, phytonutrients, like adaptogenic herbs being one example of this, but there are many others. Intermittent fasting, certain kinds of light exposure, many others. So all of these actually work primarily to stimulate our mitochondria. This is where the magic is going on. It's really at the mitochondria level. And mitochondria, guess what? Get bigger and stronger and more robust and have greater ability to produce energy. And there's even something called mitochondrial biogenesis, which is that we can literally grow new mitochondria from scratch. Now, that is a key aspect of things, because whenever you look at any kind of stress, whether toxins or infections or anything else, you have to look at the overall stress load across all of the mitochondria in the body. And if you have fewer mitochondria, and if mitochondria that you have are smaller and weaker, the stress threshold on each one of those mitochondria is much, much higher. Okay. And so they're, in other words, much more likely to trigger into cell danger response mode. Okay. The less mitochondria you have, the weaker and smaller they are, the more fragile they will be, and the more susceptible to stress they will be, and the more easily overwhelmed by stress they will be, and then you get into cell danger response mode and fatigue. Okay, so in other words, to phrase this differently, the more you have stimulated your body's mitochondria through practicing different forms of hormesis regularly, the bigger and stronger mitochondria are, and the more mitochondria you have. So whenever you encounter any kind of stressor, that stress load gets spread across much more mitochondria and bigger, stronger mitochondria, so that they don't get overwhelmed by the stress and get triggered into cell danger response mode. So we have all these layers to this system. And for different people, it's different combinations of factors. So the way my Energy Blueprint program is organized is Module 1 is all about circadian rhythm and sleep, as well as cleaning up your environment of common sources of toxin exposures on a daily basis. Module 2 is all about nutrition as well as light exposure. So I get really in depth on a lot of different kinds of light exposure that are critical to human health. Module 3, all about fixing the gut. And there's actually research showing that gut may be a main trigger of chronic fatigue syndrome for many people. And even there's some research showing that just addressing the gut only can actually fix some people almost entirely, or maybe even entirely, with chronic fatigue syndrome.
I've seen that over and over.
And then Module 4, I get into detox and boosting liver health. And it's really like a more gentle approach to detox. I'm not talking about IV chelation or anything like that. So kind of the safe and slow approach to detox. And then Module 5 is all about kind of the neuroscience, addressing psychological stress and emotional trauma, and those can also be really big triggers for some people. In fact, there are certain programs out there like Ashok Gupta's program, as well as the lightning method, that are essentially all about psychological stress and helping people to de-stress and just be happier and work on the neuroscience aspect of things. And for a portion of people, probably roughly around 20-25% of people, just addressing those things alone can actually get people massively better. And then the last one is hormesis. So once you've built the foundation of health, now we start integrating different forms of hormesis systematically and progressively into your life to actually build up the mitochondria bigger and stronger, to do exactly what I was just getting at, which is the bigger and stronger your mitochondria are, and the more mitochondria you have, the higher your resiliency threshold, which means you have to build back up your body's resiliency and the ability to handle stress, because people with chronic fatigue are often extremely fragile. Their bodies have lost their resilience and they're just easily overwhelmed by any little stress. So we have to systematically build back up mitochondrial resilience.
And how can people log in and sign up for this? What is it, 8 weeks?
Yes, it's an eight-week program. And let's actually set up a discount for your people,
Awesome.
Guillermo. This is not something that I ever do, but since you're a good friend of mine, I would love to do this with your peeps. So basically, go to theenergyblueprint.com, opt in, and then if you guys want to purchase, send me an email at ari@theenergyblueprint.com and say that you saw this podcast and that I offered you a discount, and we'll get you hooked up with $100 off. It's normally a $497 program, and so we'll give you $100 off that program. And again, I never offer this at a discount.
Hey, so amazing. Thank you so much. What are your handles?
Oh, I don't do social media so much, but yeah, people should go to my site, theenergyblueprint.com, enter your name and email, get on my email list. You'll get my weekly podcast every week. And like you, Guillermo, I'm always interviewing a lot of the top minds on the field. And of course, I've had you on before, and we're going to have you on again soon.
Awesome.
So yeah, go there, get on my email list. You get all my articles, all my podcasts, all the free trainings. Yeah, that's the place to do it.
Awesome, dude. Thank you so much. I got to jump on another interview, but I'll talk to you soon.
Great to talk to you.
See ya.